So, this is a screencast to look at the aspects of narrative voice found in the Merchant's Tale, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's an introduction, if you like, to the idea of the importance as a student of being aware of narrative voice and where that can take us. This story, this tale, comes from a collection written towards the end of the 14th century. It's hard to date precisely, but we're looking at the 1390s. And this is a time when, in England, writers were moving from, if you like, purely oral transmission to the printed word. And we see in Chaucer's writing elements of both coming out in the way that the story is told. Notice here oral AU refers to auditory rather than visual, rather than oral, spoken transmission, the key being on an audience gathered to hear a poet or a writer reading their story. There are illustrations from the 14th century purporting to show Chaucer delivering text, but certainly showing writers delivering their text to an audience. And what I think we begin to see in this tale, and it's something that you can explore a little with your wider reading for contexts, is a much greater subtlety in the narration as we move away from purely spoken delivery to delivery that might allow somebody to take the book away and read it for themselves and think about it. There's much more, if you like, beyond the elements of the oral which are so strong, and the characterization by direct speech and so on, throwaway asides by the poet, if you like, so his own voice coming through, perhaps humorously, and we can see these in the sort of the typical sort of London invective, if that's what it is, that can be heard in some of Chaucer's asides, the Lazze no namor of this, Jack a fool, and so on. This idea of the poet's voice beginning to emerge within the story is something that has happened throughout the century. But as we move into a rather more written production, things begin to change. And I've put a table here of layering, and this is something that I think actually works rather nicely. So we have a sort of conventional spoken delivery on the left-hand side of narrator and audience. Somebody stands up, tells a tale, and an audience relate to it. Now, within the Canterbury Tales, there's a wonderful sort of layering as one reads through the text. So in the general prologue, this is made slightly more complex. Chaucer as the author is obviously the narrator, but also Chaucer as the pilgrim his voice begins to appear in a slightly different way. This is him within the character that is Chaucer, who is taking part in this pilgrimage. And we begin to see, if you like, that the author can have more than one voice, the narrator can have more than one voice. Within the tales themselves, again, we may well find Chaucer's own thinking, if you like, Chaucer's own words, but also the words of Chaucer, the pilgrim, particularly in the comments he makes in individual pilgrims' prologues, such as actually the comments he makes about the merchant, where at the end of his little prologue, which describes this wealthy and avaricious man, the wonderfully caustic final line of the prologue, where we're told that Chaucer doesn't know the man's name in the general prologue. It's thrown in at the end. Beyond that, in the tale itself, of course, it purports to be told by the merchant. Thus, the pilgrim narrator has a voice, and we find the characterization of that pilgrim in the voice in which they tell the story, and eventually that is received and considered by an audience. Eventually, within the tales themselves, we add another layer. Not only have we got Chaucer the author, Chaucer the pilgrim themselves who are narrating, but of course we also have these swathes of speech delivered by individual characters, and whilst not every character is given great subtlety in the way they are presented. I mean, this would be a very new skill, a very modern thing for Chaucer to be doing. There is a definite sense that characterization is delivered through the characters' words themselves before all of this is received by the audience. Now, by the time we're working our way through potentially 4 narrative voices in a text, the fact that this is now becoming written text, printed text to be considered with some time spent thinking about what one is reading, becomes increasingly important if one is to make sense of the tales themselves. So we need to wonder about whose voice we're hearing, and in terms of this, I would suggest for this first investigation that we concentrate on the section at the beginning of this tale between lines 58 and 190 or so. The digression about wives, the introduction there from the idea of the wife. It's worth remembering as well that in the 14th century there were very few speech marks in manuscripts, and there is a sense that editorial decisions being made now are imposing, if you like, character on some of the narrative. And in this longish digression at the beginning of the tale, it's worth actually considering as a group and maybe discussing who we think might be speaking, not just for the whole section, but dividing the section up, and considering the implications of each section as spoken by the merchant, January, or Chaucer himself. And I think that over the next couple of slides, this is the area that I want to look at. In the merchant's prologue, he's introduced the idea of his wife, very much a shrewe. He has sworn not to bring his story, however, to bear on the tale. This is very clear. But then it's interesting, isn't it? Because he's speaking this, and I wonder what happens if this is his voice now being heard. Various statements to tuck a whiff, it is a glorious thing, how mich the man han any adversity that hath a whiff, and so on. If this is the voice of the merchant himself, then I think we have to read this already with a significant layer of sarcasm within the address, and that will alter the tone with which we read the story as a whole. In your groups, in your classes now, you might want to look further through this section in more detail. This is, as I say, this is an introduction, to see what you can find in terms of other moments where we perhaps shed light on the merchant as much as on anything to do with the story that he's telling. If the whole section is merely January thinking aloud and continuing, if you like, from the lines he clearly speaks, line 51 to 53, where he's talking about wedlock being so easy and so clean. And this perhaps as a continuation of those thoughts. Then again, once we've read the whole story, what are we to make of lines like with his man as helper and his comfort, or when a man is old and hoar, then is a wife, the fruit of his treasure, and so on. It's interesting, once we've read the whole story, to look at this in the idea of the characterization of January as a naive and deluded fool at the centre of this story. He also produces, if it is him speaking, this list of famous biblical wives, who are all noted man-deceivers. And again, this is something you should go away and look up for yourselves, either in the notes of your editions or in other places. And again, what does this add to the telling of the story in terms of his character? And I think one of the things that we come to here is this lovely irony that will develop as the story goes on, that January, who is made blind at the crisis within the telling of the tale, is to an extent blind all along to his own failings and to the world around him. And this again adds layers to his character, and to a degree makes him a more sympathetic character than perhaps he has appeared thus far. Now, likewise, if Chaucer is performing, if you like, his tales rather than writing them down, then it might be less of a surprise to read his own thoughts clearly emerging in the way that they do. Now, we've done work on his marriage in terms of contextual work, and you will remember that his marriage is probably far from happy. Uh, Having said that, he also relied on the links to John of Gaunt and to the wealth and the patronage that his marriage to Philippa provided. Now, we can't say categorically whether it was a happy marriage or not. It was certainly a business marriage and probably not atypical of many marriages of the time. However, by the time the Canterbury Tales were being written, Philippa was dead, as was Gaunt. Chaucer had lost his positions in London. He no longer could rely on the protection of Gaunt and therefore was now viewed with some distaste by a lot of the anti-Ricardian factions that were running the country. And I wonder whether we might begin to see that a degree of bitterness about his marriage, about the life he's lived, emerging in this passage. Again, look at it carefully, begin to see which of these lines might, well, carry an extra resonance if we realise that they're being spoken by Chaucer himself when writing about what was, at best, an estranged and difficult relationship with his wife. I think whatever level we look at this story, it's the sense of irony that's enhanced by a passage such as this, and it works at various levels. It works very, very well. The irony allows us to reveal the sarcastic tone of the merchant, the unpleasantness perhaps of the merchant. It helps to develop the character of January, which will be another lesson, into this naive and, well, slightly blind man. And I think this is vital for all sorts of things. It's a way to get some sympathy for January, but it's also very important for comedy. Comedy works extremely well when the central character is this naive character to whom things happen that he doesn't see. The dramatic irony being, of course, that we all do. It allows us to comment on Chaucer as a narrator, to comment on his life, and to just look at the ways in this story that his life might have coloured his depiction of marriage as an institution. It's worth remembering, however, that before we get too sympathetic towards January, who is a fairly vile, lecherous specimen, we might want to think about ways that what we're hearing here might help us to sympathise with May, who is caught, trapped into a marriage about which she has no choice, with this foul old man who views sex as both a recreation but also an aspect of his hard work, and wants to impose himself in every way he can on his young wife. We need to see whether the narrative helps us in any way to feel sympathy or otherwise towards May. In any text that we're reading, much as in any of the most complex texts of the 21st century, we should be considering narrative voice when we read Chaucer carefully as a way to open up interpretations and to think about the text. Every passage we read, we need to just be asking ourselves how these little moments of ironic statement, these moments that set up, if you like, both the comedy and the tensions within the story, can be interpreted depending on who we feel we are listening to at the time that they are spoken. There are moments throughout the whole tale which should make us think carefully about whether there is a difference in interpretation if we alter slightly our perception of who might be speaking at the time. Above all, with a text of this nature, it's up to you to explore and to not just read it at face value as here's a man telling a story, isn't this nice? But to look beyond that and to look at what the various alterations are to the way we perceive this tale, if the tale is taken with all the multiple layers that I have discussed. I hope this has been useful. I hope it has been interesting, and good luck with your continued studies of Chaucer's The Merchant's Tale.